Hello, so my name is Margarita Pinton Perez, and I'm the Community Partnership Leader with the Learning Network. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, welcome to our webinar, Sizing Up Gender-Based Violence Services, Identifying and Dismantling Weight-Based Discrimination. I want to acknowledge our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wuk, and Shonotonic nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. I'm delighted to be joined today by Kelsey Ione and Ramanpreet Bahar. Kelsey is a fat solo mom and sociologist who explores the way that body size, specifically fatness, impacts the ability of fat Canadian women to access healthcare services. Ramanpreet is a PhD student in the sociology department at York University. Her research concentrates on social theory, fat studies, and disability studies as she examines intersectional experiences of the body, embodiment, and effect within the South Asian diaspora. You can find their full bios in the link that we're sharing currently in the chat. We will first begin with a presentation from Kelsey and Raman, and then moving into a Q&A. Please join me in welcoming our presenters today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Raman, I don't see you. I did just mention, apologies, that on my end, I do see the French slides, not the English slides for slide control. So apologies on that. Not sure how to fix that.
Elsie, do you see a little bar at the top of your Zoom screen and it says view options?
Yep, I fixed that. Thank you.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry, thank you. Apologies about that. Welcome. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. On the slide before you, you can see a little bit more about our bios, and thank you for sharing that link in the chat to our full bios. I'm Kelsey. My colleague Raman is here as well, and we will be taking you through this webinar today on looking through, so I'm going to go back to our slide, sizing up gender-based violence services, identifying and dismantling weight-based discrimination. Just give me 1 second. Apologies. Okay. I wanted to start, as I typically would as an instructor, with the learning objectives of today's webinar. We're really hoping that from this webinar, you can take away an understanding of key concepts related to weight-based discrimination, what we will then frame as fat oppression, and how weight-based discrimination constrains the lives of fat people. We're going to identify some key barriers to accessing gender-based violence services that are faced by fat people as a result of weight-based discrimination, and the way it intersects with other identities like gender, sexuality, race, and disability. We're going to advocate for and create more, for the creation rather, of more accessible gender-based violence services through the consideration of fat people's lived experiences and of the marginalization folks face on the basis of body size, gender, sexuality, race, and disability, and the way that these identities intersect, again, to constrain the lives of fat folks. Ultimately, what Raman and I hope to do today is to give you, at the start, a broader context in this space. I imagine many of you folks are not well versed in fat studies, and Raman and I are hoping to give you a very brief sort of Fat Studies 101 to then see how we can apply this broader context of fat phobia to some situations and weight-based discrimination to some situations that limit the ability of fat women to seek out gender-based violence services. And we can see how that limitation is rooted in fat oppression and sort of how the larger systemic context of fat oppression impacts women on the individual level in their access to gender-based violence services.
Hello. So throughout this webinar, we'll be using the phrasing of fat, racialized, and or disabled people instead of people of color, people with disabilities, people of weight. The intention behind our language use here is that in naming these differences that have for so long been constructed through this process of meaning making and social discourses, which is basically this web of attitudes, ideas, practices that are institutionalized at both the level of interpersonal relations and also institutions, such as medicine, our education, social realms. We've come to see the ways in which racialized folks, fat folks, disabled folks have been framed as transgressing these hegemonic constructions of what is the ideal citizen, what is the ideal person of the state. So we take on the language of fat, racialized, disabled people as a way of subverting these biomedical models that have created different bodies and peoples as less than, as lacking, as unworthy and unprotected from the violence of oppressive systems. Additionally, in line with critical disability scholars Simi Litton and James Overbo, this protocol of using the terms disabled and non-disabled, is not only speaks to the medical model of disability, but also the social model of disability as we come to unwrap these systemic processes that have established these bodies as needing correction, needing rehabilitation in order to fit the fabrics of society. And not only that, it's a way of centering disability, fatness, and racialization as a part of the individual rather than as separate to them. Also, I do want to make a note that when we use the term disability, it encompasses the physical, psychiatric, development, sensory, environmental, and other forms of disability, both invisible and visible. So I just want to pinpoint that as well. So basically, the use of fatness here instead of people of weight, of people of size, is that in many ways, taking from critical disability studies, fat studies centers the use of fatness as a way of centering the individual, right? Fat is a part of the individual. And it becomes a redefining of these very differences as socio-political categories that are shaped by their interactions, cultural messages, social practices, and the physical environment, echoing the works of Linton and, for instance, Carla Rice from Fat Studies. So what's happening here is we will be discussing more in detail on how cultural constructions present narratives on what a body should look like and how we learn of the normal and quote unquote healthy body. And therefore, this construction of an anti-fat rhetoric that forms fat oppression and comes to intersect with gender-based violence in private and public realms. So overall, our usage of these terms is a prompt for you to also think about the socio-political spaces you are in and the ways in which different embodiments are, set up as personal tragedies, as failing these normative standards of thinness, whiteness, ableism, and sizeism, and requiring rehabilitation to become quote unquote normal.
You may have noticed in our learning objectives and when I went through them, we used the term larger bodied people. However, as fat studies scholars, we actually tend to use the term fat, racialized and disabled, as Raman said, and that's what we'll be doing throughout the webinar. So don't be alarmed when you hear the word fat to describe bodies or our own bodies, as that's the language we use, and I'm going to explain why. So as fat studies scholars and as fat women, we reject the use of biomedical terms to describe our bodies or other fat bodies. If you are a non-fat person, think of how impacting it would feel to say go to a doctor's office and be reminded that you are considered morbidly obese. Morbid, that term applied to your body in a healthcare setting where you're supposed to feel safe. It's one, for example, like overweight and obese as well, that we actively reject. We don't use the BMI scale to identify our bodies. We don't use biomedicine as a way of describing our bodies, because the biomedical model of health is one that we critically challenge in fat studies research in terms of the way health is constructed, not in the way medicine takes place, but in the way anti-fat bias is enacted on fat bodies in a medical setting. We also tend to avoid terms that talk around fat, like larger body or, chubby or plus size or curvy, at least in the academic settings that we discuss this work. And personally, in my own fat life, I use the term fat. Understandably, it's a difficult term for many folks. I certainly wouldn't call another person fat that I don't know who doesn't use that term. If you were talking about their body, I'd certainly say someone perhaps who is plus size or in a larger body. However, as fat studies scholars, we do want to recognize and reiterate that fat is an adjective. It's a descriptor about body size. It's not inherently negative. It's not inherently positive. It's a neutral descriptive word that has come to be associated with stigma, with stereotype, and with negativity. So as scholars and as fat studies activists, we use the term fat to describe our bodies. It's a way to actively push back against biomedical models, and it's a way to reclaim a term, a descriptor of our bodies that has been taken from us and used to stigmatize and stereotype our bodies. Finally, in terms of language, we actively reject attempts by healthcare providers and personnel to take up what's referred to as like a person-first approach to fat bodies. Specifically, I'm referring here to Obesity Canada, which is an organization that works alongside or has been established in the Canadian Medical Association's journal, who in 2020 released guidelines for physicians, like a huge guideline book for physicians on how to, I'm going to say, deal with fat patients, where they explicitly define obesity as a disease. Categorizing obesity, fatness, as a disease pathologizes fat people and positions them, and Raman hit on this a little bit earlier, as a major public health issue in need of solutions or cures or rehabilitation. Throughout the guide, they refer to fat patients as, quote, people living with obesity. This is a people first or person first approach that's meant to differentiate the fat person, from the, quote, disease of obesity that they're afflicted with. And there has been some calls from scholars to use this people first language with respect to obesity, arguing that it would decrease anti-fat bias and stigma against fat patients. However, adopting this people first approach to describe fat patients has the opposite effect. It further entangles fatness with disease, this idea of living with obesity. And drawing on the work of Meadows and Danielle's daughter, they note that this person-first language is mired in the medicalization of body state, so medicalizing the body. And instead of resulting in fat people being treated with more respect, which is the intention behind person-first language, and does work in other situations where people call for person-first language, it just doesn't work here. Using the term people living with obesity further entrenches anti-fat attitudes and the descriptor of, or the way in which body size is then represented as diseased, in need of cure, in need of treatment.
Okay, so this brings us to the tenet of an intersectional lens in both disability and fat justice movements. Both Kelsey and I are fat studies scholars that work towards building fat justice following an intersectional lens that comes from Black feminist scholarship of the Combahee River Collective, Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. And basically intersectionality theory was its response to a limited discussion on different bodies and how they experience systems of oppression in different ways, particularly how Black women access justice, health, education when it comes to their location, right? And we think about location, it's thinking about the body of not only being gendered, but also being racialized. Excuse me. So not only that, intersectionality theory kind of points to the limited access to resources and social systems across these intersections. Intersectionality theory as a tenet of both disability and fat justice movements pinpoints the problems that come with taking on this analysis of a primary identity only. So only taking up a gender analysis or taking up a disability analysis or a fat analysis. Because what's happening here is that like in doing one single access, we come to erase so many voices and stories. Shaida Kafai argues that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So our stories, our histories, our theoretical praxis must accurately reflect the complexity of our lives. If we don't do this, we become complicit in leaving so many people behind. When thinking about social justice, social injustices, and specifically gender-based oppression, intersectionality as a praxis thinks through the multiple ways we are impacted by larger structures of ableism, racism, heterosexism, and even sizeism, a term we will be discussing in the upcoming slides. As Kafai shares in their book called Crip Kinship, I'm going to read a quote here. We are not only disabled, we are also each coming from a specific experience of race, class, sexuality, age, religious background, geographic location, immigration status, and more. Depending on context, we all have areas where we experience privilege as well as areas of oppression. And here, through intersectionality, we gratefully embrace the privilege that this principle brings into our lived experiences and the ways it shapes the perspectives we have to offer. Fat Studies uses this framework to deeply examine the body as a social issue, as it intersects with body size, shape, weight, gender, sexuality, race, and also disability. An intersectional lens invites us to explore the histories of white supremacy, ableism, and fat phobia as being inextricably entwined with one another, created in this context of the matrix of colonial powers and these capitalist industrial machines that come to dominate ideologies, spaces, and temporalities of our diverse bodies. So when I say capitalist industrial machines, I'm thinking about how medicine takes on, for instance, this framework as this position of authority, as expertise. And that then becomes disseminated within our family circles, within the way we interact with seeking justice. So seeking some form of resolution through law enforcement or going to court. We see this within the medical realm, within education as well. There is a conversation on how our very multiple complex lives are always being implicated by these larger structures, thus creating this process of making these bodies and shaping the ways we experience our bodies and then injustices. So what's happening here is that intersectionality within fat studies is taken up to fully understand the extent in which sizeism works alongside racism, ableism, and heterosexism, and the ways it operates in society. So we're building these connections, these webs of interdependency and intersectionality through this lens. So also, fat studies integrates intersectionality theory into movement building work, and thereby aims to rid of any stigma that is associated through this negative framing of fatness and fat bodies, and instead approaches this embrace of this complexity of our diverse lives and thinking through our complex perspectives. Additionally, it invites us to create and revel in this liberatory practice. So here comes, and taking up, as Kelsey says, the terminology, even the use of fat, I am femme, like things like this. It's a way of inviting not only myself, but also those in my social circles to engage critically with these structures while writing ourselves into these larger narratives that have been missing for so long. Both of us, as fat studies scholars, explore our intersectional experiences of both privilege and also gender-based and fat oppression. For instance, we examine the ways in which our fat bodies across gender, racialization, and disability under this gaze of normalcy are cataloged, and we come to circulate within these cultural forums and interpersonal spaces as bodies to be avoided. Plus this lack of access to health or social support in the medical realm due to this medical lingo that we learn of conflates fatness with being lazy, unhealthy, and untreatable unless we work towards weight loss. So intersectionality theory really just helps us, frame this critical understanding of how problematic these biomedical notions are of bodies, and also the ways in which we're subjected to these chastising stares of these authority figures, whether it be healthcare providers, whether it be social support workers, or even strangers on the streets. So we're thinking through this criterion, that comes through these ideologies, and all in all, like intersectionality as a tenet of fat and disability justice movements exposes us to this establishing of these categories, as well as a critique of thinking through these multifaceted hierarchies and the ways they're rooted in our daily interactions and actions.
So I want to share with you some important concepts in fat studies that will help us to understand the backdrop in which gender-based violence against fat women may take place, and the context in which it may be ignored or diminished. This will help you to understand some key concepts relating to weight-based discrimination or fat oppression, and how that fat oppression constrains the lives of fat women and the services that they can then seek out. Let's start with this idea or understanding of weight stigma and anti-fat bias, which I'm going to draw on quite a bit later in our slides. As Tomiyama and colleagues tell us, the terms weight stigma, weight bias, and anti-fat bias all refer to the social rejection or the devaluation based on having a body size that does not conform to social norms or to expectations. Weight stigma can be explicit and conscious, or implicit and outside of awareness. For folks that are unfamiliar with fat studies, Raman and I keep referring to this field of fat studies that we work in. We are sociologists, so as sociologists, it's a field that we take up. But key fat studies scholars, Sandra Solovey and Esther Rothblum, explain this discipline as an interdisciplinary field, hence we are sociologists, of scholarship, marked by an aggressive, consistent, rigorous critique of the negative assumptions and stereotypes and stigma that are placed on fat and fat bodies. Doing fat studies work, as they note, requires us to be skeptical about power-ridden and prejudicial assumptions that fuel weight-based beliefs. Similarly, fat studies scholars work to combat the dominant ideologies of obesity, medicalized language that I discussed at the start of our
Les éminents, donc érudits, contribuent par leur langage
mistreatment and discrimination of fat folks, transcending demographic backgrounds, as Raman hit on in her last slide. This process of othering people, what we call fat phobia, is rooted in what's known as healthism, where fat people are seen as bad or as failures because they're not taking responsibility for their health, which we will take up some more in our later discussion to see how that understanding of failure around healthism impacts or limits or constrains the resources a fat person might seek out when experiencing gender-based violence.
So in the realm of fat studies, fat oppression has been a foregrounding topic to map out a fat politics that not only speaks to the materiality of fatness, but also the ways in which fatness is understood and shifts across intersections, spatiality, and temporality. And I use these words to kind of think about as a prompt to thinking about space and time and the ways we come to learn about, our shifting bodies. So, like ableism and racism, which speaks to this process of positioning bodies in this binary of superiority and inferiority, subject, object, knowledge practices, in terms of if we think about like non-disability and whiteness as the ideal form, these superior entities. Sizeism also maps out bodies according to size, shape, and or weight and creates this normative model of thinness according to Samantha Murray. And what happens is that it comes to function as a diagnostic standard against which variations are measured, and creating fat bodies as markers of disease and pathology, something like we've already been kind of touching upon through these slides. So under this binary of thinness and fatness, the latter, particularly fatness, is associated with negative connotations and usually is seen as being that object that is then dehumanized. So fat studies as a fat liberation project shares the ways in which fatness is socially, historically, politically, and medically constructed. It's a constructed category tied with cultural understandings of gender, sexuality, disability, racialization, and other intersectional identity points. So we see, for instance, in terms of gender-based oppression, and we'll kind of go into that, the ways in which this heteronormative feminine archetype of the thin or adequately curvy, white, non-disabled, elite, cisgender woman circulates along with the fat hatred. So sizeism overall is a system that disseminates this discourse of anti-fatness, and it comes to be lived, practiced, and felt within and through different spaces like medical, the wellness industry, the diet industry, and the larger cultural forums of, for instance, media. What's important to reflect on is how sizeism shapes literally and metaphorically how our fat bodies should be valued, experienced, contained, controlled, or completely removed unless we perform a certain archetype, that being the thin, dainty, curvy body, and then we're thinking about ability, things like that, that are associated with fatness. So some examples of sizeism are fat people experience discrimination and have unequal access to resources, including resources that would be beneficial to their health and their lived experience. There is, for instance, a denial of gender and life-affirming surgeries and or medical and diagnostic testing. In terms of police violence, fat people across the intersections of race, disability, and madness experience accelerated forms of violence, demonstrating that there's this disposability that is wrapped around marginalized bodies and the ways they're understood. So overall, we seek to remind folks that fat people deserve justice and access to equality of, life. And basically, these are human rights that have been remiss for so long.
When we started our webinar, and thank you for the wonderful introduction again. It was mentioned that Roman is a PhD student, and I just recently finished my PhD. And I want to bring this up because I'm going to, throughout the rest of our webinar today, bring in a few quotes from people from the dissertation work that I did as a PhD student. This is fairly recent from last year. I did work on, I spoke to fat women about their experiences with healthcare providers, ultimately to look at the ways in which fatness is in and of itself a barrier to accessing healthcare. When you're in a larger body, the likelihood you will access care or receive adequate care decreases. As a qualitative feminist sociologist, people's words are really important to me. People's stories are really important to me in demonstrating the impact of anti-fat bias, of fat phobia, of sizeism on people's lives. So I've pulled a few quotes to speak to help illustrate and to ground some of the ideas that Raman and I are sharing throughout our discussion today. And I wanted to start by sharing this quote from Kristen. When I spoke to Kristen, she was telling me a bit about how she avoids going to the doctor. She told me that, quote, we regularly ignore health things because we don't want to know or because it's an inconvenience, but it's just another factor on top of that is, I don't want my doctor to just ignore something very serious because, well, it's just your weight. Why even bother? Why waste my time? Why would I waste my time just to be told that it's because you're fat? So why is this important? Why do I share this quote from Kristen? Well, when patients don't trust their healthcare providers, their service providers, in whatever capacity they're interacting with them, and they've experienced discrimination, sizeism, and anti-fat bias in these healthcare settings, they're reluctant to return to their healthcare provider and other healthcare providers in the anticipation that that care will be similar across providers and be substandard. This reluctance results in long-term health consequences like incomplete follow-ups, delays in cancer or other important health screenings, an absence of care or continuity of care, and in the context of our discussion today, perhaps an avoidance of healthcare services or other frontline services or lack of trust to discuss issues of gender-based violence with healthcare providers. Many scholars have conducted quantitative work on the attitudes of healthcare professionals towards, as they say, overweight and obese patients, and ultimately concluded that the weight of a patient impacts the perception of the patient by the provider and the care they may ultimately receive. The stigma associated with fatness doesn't disappear when a patient enters a healthcare setting, right? The stigma towards overweight and obese patients is prevalent among healthcare providers for what we call this hypervisible context, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But ultimately, it results in fat people being less likely to seek medical care than their counterparts. This stigma contributes to the differential care and treatment that they receive by their healthcare providers or that they might avoid seeking out because of consistent anti-fat bias in their experiences in healthcare settings. Additionally, Kreisler and Barney argue that negative attitudes or this anti-fat bias about fat people and their health are rooted in what we call healthism, and the idea that body weight can be a predictor of chronic illness and ill health. Healthism then provides healthcare providers a space to justify their medical fat shaming or consistently bring up weight in consecutive appointments despite not being asked about weight by their patient, as well as the use of shame in efforts to motivate fat patients to lose weight, which I'm going to give you an example of in a few slides. This discriminatory treatment or sizeism itself is a health hazard. Patients who are seen to be too fat are often subjected to feelings of shame from their healthcare providers, who then provide damaging recommendations to deal with their weight. And in my dissertation, I explore this idea of weight loss at any cost and how many harmful recommendations the women I've spoke to have had from multiple providers about how they should lose weight and what they can do to do that. These recommendations result in negative physical and mental health effects and subsequent reluctance to access both healthcare and health services. And when I say this, I don't just mean seeing the doctor. This is seeing a healthcare provider, whether it's a physiotherapist because of an injury but you have experienced anti-fat bias, you're reluctant to go. Whether it's getting a massage because of how that stigma carries over, the amount of times I have to tell women in different fat activist spaces, just go get the massage, you're going to be okay. It'll be good. Or other forms of services that you may not think of associated with health that, or I'm trying to think of the word that we call these sort of like tertiary services maybe. Those are affected. It's like a radiating outwards of what services people will access when they experience anti-fat bias in healthcare settings. And we're going to see this later when we look at the scenarios that Sally in our example is facing and how this impacts the way fat women seek out services altogether and may ultimately avoid services, and that the consequences this can have on situations of gendered violence.
So as Kelsey has noted, the concept of healthism travels spaces such as healthcare and comes to conflate disability and fatness with disease and unhealthy behaviors. So the language of what we're calling the banner of the obesity epidemic and the use of the BMI or other medical tools or terminologies, they become this measure of health, and it's very problematic because these tools continue to establish a medical framing of fatness through the language of, for instance, obesity. So in Fat City scholarship, then, there has been this shift towards a health at every size paradigm for a more ethical treatment of fat people. According to Jackie Gingaras, Health at Every Size is this public health initiative that encourages practitioners and patients to focus, to shift their focus away from weight loss and weight loss practices such as dieting and bariatric surgery, and work towards like optimizing this notion of health. Health at Every Size prompts us to disengage from the biomedical and healthism models by advocating against fat stigma in support of a social justice praxis. As a model of health, it emphasized an enhancement of health by attending to the dynamic interaction between our emotional, our social, physical, spiritual worlds, without focusing on weight loss or this idea of achieving a specific ideal weight. So whereas these traditional models of healthism and sizeism denote weight loss as a central concern, in order for folks to be integrated within society, for them to be accepted, Health at Every Size shares that dieting often ultimately leads to further weight gain, for instance. It also leads to decreased self-esteem and an increased risk of disordered eating. So this paradigm prioritizes different strategies such as intuitive eating, the pleasure of eating without any reliance on food plans, or calorie counting or things like that. It also looks at the moving body and encourages all physical activities without this focus on rigid routines for the purpose of weight loss. So what's happening here is that underlying these activities then is like body acceptance and this end to weight bias. So earlier in our presentation, Kelsey kind of said like fatness is seen not as positive or negative, it is neutral. It's a neutral description. So same things happening here where the paradigm is disentangling weight from health as it thinks through these internal cues, right? Without a hyper focus on the external normative models that promote thinness as health. So the primary goal of this paradigm then is to enact a preventative measure against the development of eating problems and disengaging with risky strategies in attempt to meet this bodily container of thinness. It also works to diminish fat shame among people by issuing this respect and appreciation of the diversity of our body shapes, sizes, and just our bodies in general, without any form of morality or any type of conflation of fatness as disease, pathological, or unhealthy. But we do want to note that health at every size is not without criticism. It is still rooted in this notion of healthism, as Kelsey just described, as it assumes that people should be working towards this notion of good health, right? This idea of optimized health. In many ways, like it perpetuates this then once again binary of the good fatty versus the bad fatty. So whereas with healthism being preoccupied with personal health and this then primary exploration of defining well-being, we're really skeptical of the healthism discourses that come to surface. And in many ways, health at every size comes to overlook some the intersections of oppression and also thinking through the social determinants of health, because there's this over-reliance on the internal cues. We need to recognize that the social realm of our experiences also impacts our experience of health, fatness, and the body in general. So we need to think about fat lives as both embodied sensations as well as a social product of our external environments and the way they continue to perpetuate anti-fat attitudes. So the main critique here is that health at every size, it's doing something, but it doesn't push back through a political engaging with fat oppression and sizeism as both structure and process. Thank you for switching slides, Kelsey. So this brings us to the topic of gender-based violence on the basis of fatness. Gender-based violence takes on different forms, whether it be physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and it is largely experienced by a high rate of women, girls, two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people as they interact with folks in different spaces. In current research, it is shared that gender-based violence occurs in intimate relationships, family or kinship circles, at work, and also with strangers, and can happen both publicly, privately, and virtually as well, right? So public virtual spaces and private virtual spaces too. Some forms of violence are name calling, physical harm through hitting, pushing, blocking one's way. We see stalking and harassment as a form of violence, as well as sexual assault, financial abuse, coercive control, and manipulation tactics. In accordance to a fact sheet shared by the Government of Canada, in police reported data from 2019, 79% of women aged 15 and over experienced intimate violence, 3.5 times higher than the previous years. In self-reported data from 2018, 44% of women, so about 6.2 million women aged 15 and over, reported experiencing some kind of psychological, physical, or sexual abuse in the context of an intimate relationship in their lifetime. They share patterns of abusive behavior, of coercive control on almost a daily basis. In the data, it is further illustrated that young women between the ages of 15 to 24, Indigenous women, queer, so LGBTQA plus women, and disabled women experience an even higher rate of gender-based violence as their intersections continue to grow. So overall, folks across these intersections of race, disability, queerness, and fatness are at a higher risk due to the barriers of racism, ableism, sizeism, and heteronormativity, and may not have access to support systems in the larger community. As a human rights issue, gender-based violence has been researched and discussed for decades now. But the dialogue on this connection between gender and anti-fat violence remains limited. According to Tracy Royce, although there's a growing literature on various forms of violence against women, the intersectional analysis of anti-fat bias and violence against gendered bodies remains unexplored. Seeing that gender-based violence takes on different shapes and forms, in intimate partners specifically, gender-based violence, is employed through various tactics. And then access to justice, social support, and life in general is, basically not explored as much. And there are stories that become to be avoided and ignored. So the fact sheets of these data springing from 2018 the self-reported or the 2019 police reports, they both remiss the social location of fatness with gender when discussing intimate partner violence, and in general, gender-based violence that come to perpetuate anti-fat prejudice linked to desirability, the defeminization and asexualization of fat bodies, and we'll kind of talk about this through our examples of Sally. So sizeism comes to take on such a hold in gender-based violence that we see fat hatred and fat-hating culture take a hold in the household and intimate relationships, first and foremost. So it is in this central locus where we witness gender-based violence intersecting with fat oppression, and then maintaining what we call a politics of domination within society. And this politics of domination does not only inflict violence upon fat women in ways specific to their size. Roy suggests it is because of their size they are targets of a variety of forms of violence. So these anti-fat cultural tropes of fat people as undesirable, asexual, and defeminized, so unfeminine entities, and then the fat-phobic language rooted in biomedical discourses, which frame fat people, fat female bodies, for instance, as out of control, excessive, or even immoral, pave the way for these violent practices to surface. So this framing of the fat female body with such undertones makes them even more vulnerable to due to the anti-fat biases and the discriminatory practices. As the intersections of one's lived experience increase, so do the barriers of violence and gaining access to social support systems like family, healthcare, and legal, as we've mentioned. What is largely the case is this avoidance and the invalidation of fat narratives of abuse. So we see this within law enforcement, healthcare, and even families, where there is a fat shaming occurring through the process of not only witnessing, but also disclosing these gendered power differentials and the violence that comes with it. And in many ways, what's happening is, and we think about the intersectional experiences, fat women are then, in these narratives positioned as unsexy, and I'm going to use the word unrapeable, thus re-victimizing them in the process of seeking aid. So gender-based violence and anti-fat violence are really interconnected here. So this brings us to Sally's experience, our first example. So we'll zoom into Sally here, and then we'll zoom out into the larger context. Sally's experience of gender-based violence and its interaction with sizeism is very much prevalent here. So we see Sally's partner, Riley, tell her how lucky she is to be with him because of how fat she is. He often throws out food or limits her meal portions. Riley also starts to hit Sally and lock her out of the house, telling her to go for a walk. On the left side, I just want to share that there is an image of a trash bin with food and other things like what appears to be clothing and boxes overflowing the bin. Next slide, please. Thank you. So early in this presentation, we introduced this idea of fatness seen as an individual lacking and unworthy. So this is kind of framed as an individual deficit model. And the discourse of sizeism and healthism work together to mark and pathologize fat people as, unworthy subjects. And I use the word subjects here very loosely because in social spaces, fat bodies take on, in most cases, the position of the other, the object that violence is inflicted upon. So these practices are, in fact, not rare whatsoever. We see fat-phobic language and social practices continuously objectify fat bodies and unleash multiple versions of versions of fat shame upon them. The fat shaming and mistreatment of fat bodies and fat people is justified through these representations of fatness as a bodily behavior that is unhealthy, abnormal, and not a standardized version of living. In Sally's example, there is that conflation we see of health and beauty, where she's subjected to this idea of the object position as being far from the ideal. And what's happening here is there are then these normative expectations placed on Sally and this measure of surveillance and discipline to which Samantha Murray suggests, like, we come to see these anti-fat knowledges dictate a mode of social control that is both internal and external to the fat person. And also, what's happening here is a shaping of fat womanhood as needing surveillance and discipline. So if we were to zoom back into the example of Sally, the use of fat-phobic language and phrases such as she's lucky to be with him or so fat is the first step of fat shaming at the internal level, as these dialogues shared by her partner are internalized, denoting that she is far from thin, attractive, or this hourglass shape that we kind of talk about with sizeism and shapeism takes on a discursive nature, allowing sizeism and shapeism to position her fat body as one that is failing the archetype of femininity and therefore deserving of such discipline on behalf from Riley. Next slide, please.
Are you there?
Thank you. So what's happening here, these politics of domination intensify as the acts of mistreatment and expressions of desirability expressed by Riley, comes to really create this unsafe home environment for her. The common theme is that Riley blames Sally for the violence inflicted upon her. She's told she's fat, she's scolded, she's punished for being fat. And what's happening here is that fat studies would look at this example and suggest that this form of fat shaming and abuse enacts a form of punishment for failing to adhere to these socially prescribed notions of gender and thinness. The verbal punishment enacts this idea of desirability where fat women are positioned as ugly, and undeserving of any love and tenderness from their partner. So on a routinely basis, verbal punishments such as those shared by Riley are instilled with this idea of, this idea that she cannot leave these situations because she will never be able to receive any type of love other than Riley's form of disciplinary love. So there's form of fat shaming and overall violence through these coerced displacement through the act of locking her out, forcing her to walk as a form of exercise. So what's happening here is that this abuse of fat shaming experienced by Sally then is basically speaking to that conflation that we've been talking about of fatness as out of control, unhealthy, inactive, and an unattractive lifestyle. And disciplinary partners like Riley take on surveillance and regulatory tactics as a form of helping, change Sally's pathological body to one that is rehabilitated to fit this archetype of the normal, beautiful, healthy woman. Something that we need to recognize is these instances of violence is associated with low self-esteem, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the barriers to exit these abusive relationships. And the stigmatization of fat women and the larger impact on their mental health and well-being is recorded by fat studies scholars to point that not only do fat women diminish their voices, but also diminish the ways they take up space, literally and metaphorically. So they're trying to take as less space as possible. Sally's example is a part of a larger pattern of gender-based violence we've seen surface in the media and in our own lives. Fat shaming has been engraved in my story as a teenager and adult, and in many ways, Sally's story was relatable to me as it weaved connections between the intergenerational level of fat women, the intergenerational trauma, and the intergenerational relationships of sizeism between fat women in my life who continue to be a version of Sally in their own homes. So within interpersonal relationships, whether it be family members, potential partners, or healthcare professionals, my fatness was always this anchor of fat shame and fat stigma, where under the sizeism and shapeism models, my fatness, brownness, and feminist was always a public spectacle to be ridiculed and judged by my normative counterparts. This notion of normalcy and the thin female body were framed as a box I must work towards fitting in. So in many ways, like I was always framed as lazy. And then with having PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, that whenever I disclosed that, people would always respond with like, maybe you should do XYZ to become healthy, to get rid of not only PCOS, but fatness under this through weight loss programs such as Dr. Bernstein or Weight Watchers, or even bariatric surgery. And what's happening here also is that the male and thin normative gaze within the dating world became a force of its own, as I saw potential partners become these disciplinaries like Riley that repurpose sizeism and healthism as a form of unsolicited advice for his diet and workout plan. And also this emotional turmoil through the phrasing of "this is for your betterment, not mine." Or if you're to lose weight, you'll be so much prettier. Kelsey, you could go ahead.
Okay, so I want us to zoom back in on Sally's experience, the second part. And on this slide, we see an image of a scale on the left, and it tells us that Sally's family often witnessed Riley's behavior and would reassure her that he was just concerned about her health. They encouraged her to try dieting since she would be so beautiful if she just lost a few pounds. Sorry, I went a little too far. Okay. Building on Raman's experience and certainly echoing Raman's experiences in my own and in the women I spoke to's experiences, but I've pulled some excerpts from my participants to share with you, talking about their parents, which we see in Sally's example, her family life outside of Riley, the way in which diet culture is taken up as family-wide surveillance of fat people's bodies. And like I mentioned, I pulled a few quotes here to share with you around the interactions of parents and fat women about their health, or more specifically, their weight. These interactions start in childhood, building the framework in which parents will see their child's health even when they're adult children and comment on sort of their best intentions, right? When I discussed child health care experiences with women in Toronto, the overarching commonality was the role that their parents played, more specifically the role their mothers played, in participants' experiences with their doctors, and the enforcement of extreme weight loss measures based on the advice of doctors, rooted in that authority that comes from the doctor. So for example, and I mentioned earlier in the presentation that I would give you an example of the way shame is used for weight loss. Jane, and I've shared her quote on the board, and personally I find this to be a very difficult quote to share, but Jane shared with me how her experience as a child and the advice her doctor gave her mother to take up in the home to, quote, prevent Jane from overeating. So Jane told me that, quote, the doctor would tell my mom and not tell me, and give my mom stuff for me to eat and not tell me, making my mom in control of this, so that it's not my responsibility, it's my mom's responsibility. I didn't have a choice not to diet. My mom was the one who was giving me food, right? I was never allowed food because my mom didn't allow me. My brothers were allowed to go and grab snacks or whatever, but mine would be arranged. She used to give them dessert after I went to bed, but I blatantly knew what was going on because this was the doctor's recommendations. She put bells on the food room, so when you opened it, she could hear. It was horrible. I felt so bad about myself growing up. When I was talking to Jane, all I could think about was how humiliating of an experience, how shameful this must have felt for her. Her doctor recommended her mother put sound devices through bells or some other form of noisemaker on the fridge, the cabinets, and the pantry, so that she would be audibly notified if Jane tried to get something to eat in order to stop her. This noise would also notify everyone else in the house that Jane was trying to access food, creating shame and humiliation. Parents are not seen only to be responsible for food intake, but for the interventions required to reduce the size of their children. Quirk in 2016 found that the messaging around the parental role in weight loss for fat children hasn't changed in the past 30 years. The messaging parents receive on how to help their fat children is to get them to eat more healthy food, get them to exercise, eat less junk food, and be less sedentary. Many of the women I spoke to discussed the role of their parents in their forced attempts at weight loss as children, and the involvement of their parents in their healthcare appointments. As children and youth, their parents, often their mothers, attended doctor's appointments with them. As Jane mentioned above, this resulted in her doctor focusing on her mother and in embedding her mother with the responsibility for Jane's health and weight. often conflating those two things together. And this was a common theme with other participants as well. So for example, on the slides, I share with you the example of Brielle, who described her mother's presence at her doctor's appointment and how she herself did not need to bring up her weight because either her mother or her doctor would do it for her in conversation with each other, not with her. Brielle notes that until I moved out, my parents would always be with me at doctor's appointments or whatever, and they would always bring it up, or my doctor would bring it up. I never needed to bring up my weight because other people would do it for me. The impact of the family on efforts for weight loss is explicitly tied with the interaction with healthcare professionals for fat people, especially with those who were fat as children. Harrison argues that the discourses of childhood obesity epidemics are making children the target of regulatory practices that are generally ineffective and sometimes physically harmful, quite painful, or extremely humiliating. She notes that this intervention often takes place in the family. And I would further this understanding by arguing that this intervention often takes place in the family at the instruction or directive of healthcare professionals. I found consistently throughout my interviews that parents, especially mothers, were hyper-focused on their children's weight, and that this focus and concern was rooted in discussion with their child's doctor and the advice from their doctor, which was almost always harmful, humiliating, or extreme. Now, I want to recognize the larger context of this discussion, especially as someone who is sort of embedded in motherhood studies as well, that there's a whole different discussion here on why it's mothers that are given this regulatory advice, the expected responsibility of motherhood associated with womanhood, that I don't want to discount, but is not relevant to today's discussion. Zooming back into Sally's situation and the assertion from her family, and even though not explicitly stated, I would likely say her mother, that she would be so beautiful if she lost a few pounds. We can see how diet culture, as Rushwater puts it, creates what's called family-wide surveillance. And I would argue that this surveillance is built on the foundation of early policing of the bodies of fat children and the pressure on parents, or the responsibility of parents for, quote, managing the weight of their children by the healthcare system and society at large. And how this then continues on as their children's body grows. So one example I could say is, I am 32. I have been fat my whole life. My mother has been obsessed with my weight my whole life. And not too long ago, despite my sort of embeddedness in fat studies, she said something to me along the lines of, Kelsey, I worry so much about your weight, especially now that you've made fatness your identity. You're not going to take it seriously. Still, as an adult, I'm 32 years old. I'm still getting this discourse from my mother, though it has shifted, which I was going to share. And I'm not sure how many other larger or fat women are in this virtual room who can relate to this, but I'm sure many can or have heard similar things. But I can certainly speak to the way in which my parents, especially my mother, would talk about the way in which my body size would impact, as Roman was talking about on the last slide, my dating prospects. She would say to me, don't you want to have a boyfriend when you're older, Kelsey? Or you should lose weight if you really want to have a boyfriend. Don't you want to get married? I'm in my 30s now, and I still hear this in my head. This discourse from when I was a young teenager to middle-aged teenager to early adulthood. Not only that, but the discourses around desirability of fat bodies and the connection I want to make to Sally's experience of how lucky she is to be in that relationship, how lucky we are as fat women when someone, quote, chooses to date us, what a sort of word I'm looking for, sort of slumming it down here with us fat women, it remains in our thoughts as we navigate relationships. And certainly, I stuck out my own rocky relationships in my 20s that I should have left sooner, where situations were contradictory to my own feminist beliefs and sort of strong personality, because what if someone else didn't want me? Don't I want to have a boyfriend? You hear my mom's voice in my head. Let's talk about the third example with Sally. On the slide, you see the visual of a healthcare provider on the left with like a chart in her hand. And it notes that Sally went to see a doctor after Riley pushed her down the stairs and she began having intense migraines. The doctor asked if she tripped a lot since she doesn't move around a lot, and said the real concern was getting Sally's weight under control. In discussing Sally's individual experience here, I want us to zoom out and understand how experiences in healthcare settings perpetuate feelings of shame around the body and body size. As I found in my own research, anti-fat attitudes held by healthcare professionals, especially primary care physicians, that sort of first point of contact in the healthcare system, result in weight-based discrimination for fat women in healthcare settings, further entrenching that fat phobia in healthcare. When healthcare providers, professionals, service providers, when they make assumptions about their patients on the basis of their body size, it can cause harm to the patient themselves. There are subtle or sometimes not so subtle indications to the patient that their body is unacceptable or flawed or not worthy of care. My participants shared with me these experiences of weight stigma, resulting in negative or non-existent relationships with their doctors, and ultimately in the denial of care by their doctor or the avoidance of care by themselves. Avoiding care or being denied care can ultimately have devastating or life-threatening consequences. Certainly can be life-threatening in situations of gender-based violence. Many of the women I spoke to expressed the fear of having healthcare concerns ignored or undiscovered because their doctor makes incorrect assumptions about their health based on their weight. This is something I experience in my own life, my everyday life. It took a long time to build a healthcare team around me to support unrelated issues to my health that is actually like values me as a person and not just as a fat person. But it's a looming fear that something will slip by undiagnosed due to doctor negligence or avoidance rooted in anti-fat bias and fat phobia. As Joy Cox tells us, how can any fat person be assured that they will receive adequate care in facilities with healthcare workers who have been taught that their size is reflective of the feelings they have about themselves and that they lack willpower to achieve goals that will assist in making them healthy? How much trust should a fat person put into a doctor who repeatedly prescribes weight loss despite their office visit having nothing to do with their weight, like Sally's on the screen? Sally went there because she fell down the stairs, or rather she was pushed down the stairs, and she was having problems like migraines that could come from things like a concussion from being pushed down the stairs, from traumatic brain injury, from being pushed down the stairs. Even if she describes it to her doctor as falling or tripping down the stairs, the potential physical effects of tripping and falling down the stairs are separate in and of themselves from her fat body. They do not connect. It's been established in the literature on body size and healthcare that a common experience for fat women in these spaces is to have doctors attribute fat patients' health and their concerns to the size of their body, regardless of the actual concern, like what we just discussed with Sally. In understanding this phenomenon, we draw on Janine Gailey's concept of hyper-invisibility, where she explains how the hypervisibility of the body, so the visibility of fatness that cannot be hidden, convinces the doctor that the health concern is due to fatness. Simultaneously, the hyper-invisibility of fat people's lived experiences renders their knowledge about their own bodies and symptoms invisible. Gailey notes that since most people believe fatness is intrinsically tied to ill health, that this entrenchment does not disappear with physicians or other service providers, resulting in this hyper-invisibility of fat women in healthcare spaces. And this further enforces the oppression fat women and fat patients face and the anti-fat bias they experience. We can also draw on the work of fat studies scholars around disciplinary medicine and the medical gaze. So Samantha Murray describes the fat body as a site of forced confession. And this is because you cannot hide your fat body. Those who are fat are seen as immoral subjects, and by virtue, their visible fatness results in them, quote, confessing their immorality. You can't hide this immorality you have because you're carrying it on your body. And this forced confession is especially present in the healthcare space. You know, you see Sally's doctor immediately jump to a discussion around her weight, that visibility of her fatness versus her actual concerns. And in this case, you can even link to the invisibility of her migraines, for example. With respect to fatness, the fat body is always visible when it comes into contact with anybody, but especially with doctors. And the accompanying perception of that visibility is believed to correlate to knowledge about fatness. The fat body confesses, absent of any discussion, and it results in the pathologization of fat bodies. The fat body, as Samantha Murray tells us, always performs a silent confession, one of pathology, indulgence, laziness, disease. And this occurs before the patient has even spoken to the doctor. because of that hypervisibility, that forced confession. And this leads to what Samantha Murray refers to as disciplinary medicine, which refers to how medicine relies on morality to enforce control and regulate fat bodies, people's understandings of their bodies, and their personal responsibility. And certainly here, Sally's doctor is discussing, or rather engaging in, disciplinary medicine. What are you doing wrong? Why aren't you losing weight? Why aren't you in control of your body? So this, as I mentioned, is exemplified by Sally's experience with her doctor. Her doctor bypassed a discussion on what brought Sally in to see them. She jumped immediately to accusing Sally of injuring herself, being that responsible for her injuries by tripping, due to her, quote, not moving around a lot, drawing on that confession Murray discusses of Sally's fat body, confessing to her doctor her supposed laziness, right? Her supposed lack of exercise. And indeed, Sally is also hyper invisible in this space. Her fat body is hyper visible to her doctor, and its mere existence provides the doctor space to engage in anti-fat bias and shaming of her body by suggesting that her pain is due to tripping. She's hyper invisible, and that the intimate partner or gender-based violence she's experiencing is going uncaptured and unexplored. Her doctor does not take the time to do a full evaluation of what might be causing her migraines. When they started, what was happening before the migraines? Are there any changes to your stress levels? Have you been engaging in any different behavior? What's going on in your home? Do you have support? Things that doctors are trained to ask that could tease out other components of your life, like gender-based violence, that might be contributing, not just gender-based violence, right? Like, our doctors are there to get that fuller picture, and they tend to know what to ask. But when you jump straight to, well, you tripped because you're not moving around a lot, there's no exploration of what else might have led to this situation. Zooming out of Sally's individual experience, we can see how anti-fat bias in healthcare often results in the neglect of fat patients' real health concerns, focusing only on their weight. What Sally will likely take away from this experience, and if I had to guess similar previous experiences, is that her doctor is not a safe person. It's unlikely she will return in the future for help, and I highly doubt that she will feel comfortable discussing the gender-based violence that she's experiencing in her home, even if, and as we know with gender-based violence, it will tend to get worse.
Kelsey and Raman, I don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to ask that we'd love to leave some time for a Q&A. There's so much that and I hope you have an opportunity to peek in the chat, because there's been so much engagement and a positive response. But I wanted to leave a little bit of time. And also, we just had a request from our interpreters and ASL if we could speak a little bit more slowly for that part. So I'll just let you carry on, and hopefully we can leave about 10 minutes, like a minute or two more, so we can have an opportunity to do a Q&A. Thank you so much.
Apologies. Okay. Okay. So folks at home, you have this slide. I'm going to bypass it, but it just includes some real life examples of experiences of fat folks with their healthcare professionals. For example, Rachel's quote is a favorite of mine. I had this lovely story of a doctor. This doctor had a lovely story about his wife, about how she essentially starved herself, and that's how she was able to lose weight and keep it off. And that was the doctor's suggestion for Rachel. Raman, I'm going to move to you to close us out with moving towards accessibility and social justice practice, though I will suggest to you that we have a lot of information here.
We were trying to figure out a way of how to give that Fat Studies 101 without overloading, but we realized that we kind of did. It's just a part of it. I think that's just how we are at this point, because we have to establish every aspect of what we do. But hopefully at this point, our zooming in and out of this intersectional experience of gender and fat-based violence, demonstrates the way this conversation demonstrates the problematic and harmful behaviors that come to be inflicted onto fat people across the intersections in multiple space. We hopefully have presented through our examples the need to transform our understanding of fat life, fat bodies, and fat people by challenging these sociopolitical constructs that have been created and maintained through these systems, these interlocking systems of oppression. So this webinar, for one, is a stepping stone to presenting these narratives and counter narratives of fat people and their lived experience of fat stigma and the pain that is usually come to be felt on their bodies as they are counted, measured, and violated on a daily basis. For instance, in the home space, the healthcare space, and other spaces. So this is a step away from the individual deficit model that we've seen surface in these three examples of Sally. And instead is an acknowledgement, it's a recognition of the ways in which society comes to create these systems and experiences of marginalization. As fat studies scholars, we deploy a social justice framework to remind folks that fat oppression is in fact a human rights discourse, and that we should prioritize access, equity, and the participation of fat and otherly marginalized communities. So we're thinking about intersectionality, there's then also a move towards collective access and collective liberation. So we're creating these spaces where we shouldn't be flagging our experiences in doctors. We shouldn't be, quieted or avoiding. Instead, this idea of collective access and liberation pushes folks to unlearn the dualisms of gender and sizeism through a reclaiming and retelling of our stories outside these tropes of it gets better if you work on yourself, you will overcome and whatnot. It's just a recognition and validation and healing of our communities. This is our last note, I promise. So this social justice framework is creating accessible and safer futures for fat folks with the formation of what we call subjugated knowledges and this act of witnessing. So we're pushing forth these, we're pushing against these expert knowledges that have become laymen. Sorry if I'm going too fast once again. So these ideas that have established our bodies as less than is basically then pushing forth the subject. We're pushing forth a subjugated knowledge where it's our stories taking full center as we discuss cultural practices and interactions. Both of us as researchers and fat people across the intersections are politicizing our experiences, echoing Jill Andrew. So let's think about the Charter of Rights and Freedom and its role of maintaining the disposability and marginalization of bodies. As a constitutional document, it is an important piece, sections 15 and 7, they outline life, security, and equality for everyone. Yet in actuality, that is non-existent for many fat people across the intersections. So here, as fat studies scholars, we're thinking through the ways in which this question of life and security is not afforded to fat folks under fat oppression and gender-based violence. So we're thinking about the ways in which there's a disproportionate rate of violence experienced. So we're asking for this broadening of Section 15 equality rights of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to truly understand fatness as a social location. So it's adding to that understanding, and then also this notion of equality rights. This also builds an awareness and education on this experience of fat phobia, eating disorders, which are at a high rate. Along with this demand of legislative change, we call for further research to be done by Statistics Canada to grasp the breadth of knowledge and the rates of fat and gender-based oppression is happening. It's very limited, like we said, but we're here to speak more about it to the best of our abilities. And hopefully the two of us as scholars and other folks in the field are working towards establishing this stream of knowledge on gender-based violence alongside sizeism. The floor is open for question and answers. And like I said, we just sped through everything. So we're here to respond
That
to
was,
any
you'll
questions.
take a look at peek in the chat. There has been so much positive response, very engaging. The time flew by for folks. So I'm going to just say thank you so much for the clarity, the way you walked us through all of this, drawing from research, really helping ground the discussion and the examples that you shared. So I want to take this opportunity for us to now move along to the answer and question period. participants have been submitting. So for folks, if you've not had a chance yet, please type your questions into the Zoom Q&A box. And I'm delighted to invite my colleague Sabri Adel-Sadi, from the implementation coordinator for the Francophone Liaison for the Knowledge Hub, who will be supporting with this next step of sharing some of the questions from folks. All right, it looks like I'm first. So what we've done here is these are essentially worded the exact wording from those who've submitted, right? There's so one question here from someone in the audience was, I appreciate your stance on the wording around obesity. However, as a physician, we are being told it's inappropriate, offensive, and isolating if we don't use phrases like living with obesity and viewing obesity as a disease. This becomes very confusing and then makes physicians afraid to broach the subject at all, even when we want to, from a health-centered approach. What advice would you give to physicians?
I'm going to take this one immediately because one comes to mind. Most of my physicians know my experience. One of my go-to safety mechanisms for myself is when I introduce myself to a new one, I say, yeah, and I'm a sociologist who studies weight-based discrimination in healthcare. It's my sort of underlying, and let's not do this. But I see a rheumatologist frequently for rheumatoid arthritis. And one thing that comes up quite a bit is I will say, I don't know if this pain in my knee is because of my arthritis or it's the reality of living in a large body. I give this example because she will then say to me when we're done with the examination component, hey, Kelsey, you mentioned your weight and your knee. Do you want to talk about your weight? Which gives me the opportunity to say, no, I don't really want to talk about it. Or, yeah, I would actually like to talk about what we can do around my weight to manage my arthritis, for example. If you've had the conversation with your patient, one thing as fat study scholars would like to say is we know we're fat, right? Like we know we live in our body. If you've had the conversation once, asking your patient, is this something you want to explore today? If it comes up in conversation, really we would say, just don't assume that your patient wants to talk about their weight or that the reason they're there is because of their weight. Other doctors would say to me, like, Kelsey, this, or the other thing. And if I had a smaller patient, I would be giving this advice. But I do think there's an interaction of your weight with, say, the frequency with which I roll my ankle. And my like, it's not an ignoring that weight is there. It's not a denial that weight is there. It's a treating your patient with respect and autonomy and not enforcing weight loss as the prescription to anything they have come to see you about.
Thank you. Thank you again for this insightful presentations and sharing your research results. It was very informative and our audience had several questions, and here one of those. The presenters acknowledged that they are reclaiming the word fat after it has been stigmatized and given a negative connotation. My question is whether the use of the term fat is acceptable for people who do not identify as a fat, especially when used merely as a descriptor and not in a negative manner.
I'll take this. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of challenges that come with the use of fat. That being first, like depathologizing it, breaking it down as a neutral description. As someone who began my fat politics like 10 years ago, my use of fat was very limited. I used to prefer using plus size or a larger body instead of fatness. But as I became more aware of these intersectional forms of violence, fatness started to really anchor in my experiences at a grander level. So even when thinking through our interactions with doctors, interactions with people, whether it's forms of microaggressions or the ignorance of treatment plans, fatness ends up being this identity, yes, but also a neutral term for folks like us as a way of pinpointing, like, this is who I am, and I am requesting some form of support, or there is pushback towards making the language more accessible for us. So hopefully that kind of pinpoints an entry point to the use of fatness or fat bodies or fat people for us as labels, without the idea of label.
And I think that if you're in a situation where like if you're in a group with Raman and I and you're discussing something and we use the term fat, feel free to use it, right? I think my response would be avoid using overweight, obese, morbidly obese. Things like plus size or in a larger body. These are okay descriptors. They're not ones we use as fat study scholars, but they're not negative. They can be used in place of obese, morbidly obese, my favorite one, as more neutral and less biomedical ways of describing people's bodies or body size.
And it also speaks to like the microaggressions, right? That like when folks say like, but you're not fat, you're pretty, like even with that, like this idea of fatness as a negative connotation is there, right? So we're kind of saying like it's up to the person, but within our larger spaces of fat study scholarship, fat activism, we use fatness as the word. But folks are usually in my personal circles, if they want to use plus size, if they want to use thick, is totally acceptable.
Thank you, Ramanpreet and Kelsey. One last question before we finish the webinar. How does fat oppression impact trans men and trans masculine people in terms of how their bodies are weaponized by oppressors/aggressors? For instance, you mentioned fatness as a barrier to gender affirming care.
Yeah, can I start this one? When I did my research, I did my research specifically on women. And the reason I chose that, and this was a question that came up in my defense similarly, was because of the sort of primary care you get with your biology associated with being a woman, right? Reproductive care, pap smears, these sort of things that breast cancer screenings that would may be avoided with not going to a primary care physician. I spoke to people, I had at least one participant, which isn't a great representation, I want to acknowledge this, who was assigned female at birth and was sharing with me their difficulties getting top surgery, how they were asked to self-report their weight on something, and on the day of their top surgery, the surgeon refused their surgery because of what the reality of their BMI. And there's a whole discussion around what surgeries can take place in a clinical setting based on anesthesiologist requirements for BMI and aesthetic. And so this participant of mine who wanted to participate in my research indicated to me they were assigned female at birth, and that's why they wanted to participate, shared with me their experiences of the difficulty to get top surgery, for example, based on the way BMI measures are used in clinic settings for anesthetics. There's a lot of great work done by Jake Pine, who does work on fatness and trans identities. I don't want to speak to an area that I don't necessarily have that knowledge base, but I do want to say that there are folks in our fields who are doing that research on trans masc people, fatness, the difficulties with getting gender affirming care, and that sort of discussion as well. Oftentimes trans mascs have to pay for their top surgeries privately, and travel to a private surgeon. And this is something I hear from trans friends, not necessarily in the context of my research, but in the context of friends who are trying to get top surgery, for example. That being said, there is a discussion in this field around trans bodies and the intersection with fat bodies, and Jake Pine is a huge researcher in this area, along with a few others out of the Revision Center at Guelph as well, that I would recommend looking up. Oh yes, and the chapter in our book from Jen Marshall, who is a fat trans writer on this issue as well.
Well, that's all the time that we have today. Thank you so much, Kelsey, Raman. The level of engagement, the clarity that you spoke with, and I really echo some of those comments in the chat, but we wish there was more time and people were saying they want to read your dissertation. There's all sorts of great feedback in there. So I just want to thank you for your time today. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our ASL interpreters, Courtney and Vanessa, and French language interpreters, Sylvie and Caroline. And we ask for folks that are on the call in the audience, please don't forget to complete the evaluation form to receive a certificate of participation. A link will automatically open in your browser after the webinar has ended. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
We wanted to also share our thank you to the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub, as well as the audience members. We value your input, your questions so much, and thank you for hanging along with us for this very long presentation. We welcome any emails and comments. Our emails are shared in the slides, so feel free.
I also want to thank and apologize to the ASL interpreters who I did not have the chat open and did not see the request to slow down, and I am so sorry.
Thank you.